Humanianity, a new religious call. Humanianity, religion for us all. Humanity, now we all can see. Humanity, how much better we can be.
Hi, I'm Bill Van Fleet, and this is Humanianity Conversation number 76, recorded on September 3rd, 2020. It is the fifth recorded conversation with Jordan Thompson, who has a strong interest in philosophical issues and has become interested in the Humanianity Project. We reviewed the concept of humanity as a change in our species' ethics and general way of living that is still very early in its development and therefore hard to see, and seemed to agree on the value and possibility of this change. But as the discussion went on, it became apparent that we had different views as to how it might occur, and specifically, if it could only occur through revolution and therefore violence, as opposed to incremental, nonviolent change. This issue remains for further discussion. So, have you been thinking about what we might talk about?
Yes, so I felt as though our conversations so far have been sort of contained within a greater position of mine, which is that, as far as I understand it anyway, Humanianity is most compatible with communism in terms of any known attempts so far in human history to structure society based on, in a way that it hasn't been structured before. Does that make sense so far?
Uh, Not yet. um,
Okay. Well,
it's
I'll
a
try to rephrase.
yeah,
Oh,
it's a
go ahead.
connection. It's a connection I'm not making, um, and so it might be useful to review what your concept is of humanity.
Okay. Um, I understand humanity at the moment to be a sort of process or experience within individuals of growing in um, their rational ethics, and then sort of being, if you want to call it like an actual thing outside of individuals, you could just say the collective growth of individuals in that way. And then eventually it could be, well, I don't know if you would agree, but my inference is that eventually, once enough people sort of move up the cone in the metaphor, would result in some sort of structure for society that would reinforce or be founded upon conclusions made through a greater adherence to rational ethics.
Well, that sounds uh, like it's pretty close. I'm not sure, though, that uh, that we are talking about exactly the same thing. Um, Quite possibly we are. Can you maybe then say how you conclude that communism uh, is the social structure that that would be the way of our governing ourselves in this world at that time when we had shifted.
I should maybe rephrase slightly to say that I'm not sure that communism is what the world would look like at the pinnacle.
Mm-hmm.
My claim is that communism is the structure that we have postulated about so far as a species that I believe is most compatible with the HUEP.
Uh-huh. Okay, and maybe that is so. I believe that you probably are more familiar with the details of what, quote, communism means and than I. I have not actually visited that conceptual area in a very long time. Could you clarify, what does communism mean?
Okay, as you might have guessed, it means a wide variety of things from different people throughout history. Um,
Yeah.
what it means to me and what it means to some individuals who wrote books about it and know more about it than I do, uh, is a society which is based on the standard of from each according to their capacities to each according to their needs. So it's difficult to say what it is because, or give a detailed account of what it would look like, because it's something that has not existed up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So most people, Marx included, Karl Marx, spent more time discussing general values and how those values are not being met and have not been met by the societal structures that have existed so far.
Mm-hmm.
So communism, different people have had different ideas of what that standard I just spoke to would translate to in terms of an actual government or lack thereof. I personally would assume that a government would persist in a communist society, but generally the idea is the abolition of the profit motive as a means for societal growth, and instead base any sort of market on necessity rather than on the highest possible amount of consumption matched with the highest possible amount of production. It's hard to know how to encapsulate it
Yeah.
beyond that without, I guess, without more questions for clarification, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can say that my thinking has not gone very much in that direction of, oh, what will society look like at that time? Because I think that that would be hard to predict. However, one of the things that comes to mind is that what we have found is that those things that are related to our being a dominance hierarchy species tend to cause an enormous amount of pain, suffering, disability, and early death. And that and that tendency to be a dominance hierarchy species means that we have our ways of looking down upon some and up to others. And of course, we have built into us a very strong concern about whether we are being looked down upon or being looked up to, or exactly where we are in the hierarchy. And that when we have gone much more to this new kind of ethics that is not authoritarian and based upon obedience to the most powerful and so forth, but instead is indeed rational ethics that is rationally consistent with the Humanian ultimate ethical principle, that we should do that which will promote not only the survival of our species, but also as much joy, contentment, and appreciation as possible, and as little pain, suffering, disability, and early death as possible for everyone now and in the future, then that is indeed a concern for everyone, and our tendency to be motivated to be above each other is inhibited. It's not going to disappear from our basic hominid nature, but so indeed, it is a good point that you're raising, that in communism, there is the concern about everyone, and if anyone is not doing well, that we want to help that individual to indeed join us who are doing better and so forth. It is hard to imagine, in my mind, that at that time in the future, we would actually give up all of that tendency to that dominance hierarchy stuff. We know that a tremendous amount of our social activity is playing around with that. I mean, that's what sports is. So we enjoy competition, and so it sounds to me the thing that has come to my mind about that is that what would be perhaps more appropriate, and I don't know whether this would be the final state of things if we ever got to that ultimate state of perfection or close there too. We can never say we're perfect. Would be that that we would that a person growing up in this world would first of all be assured that their basic needs were met, so that then on top of that, they could live their lives the way they wanted to. And if, for instance, if they were interested in art or in music, that they could go in that direction, Or if they were interested in competitive sports, they could go in that direction. But that would be on top of this assured basic satisfactory quality of life that everyone has. So I think it is unlikely that we would have a strong ethical principle that says we must never compete. That doesn't sound like something that that we would ever arrive at, because the question would be, well, why not? And that would be, why not if it doesn't cause any problem? So the question is, could competition be an interest for those who indeed were interested in it? Some people are more competitive than others, perhaps on a genetic basis, and so forth. That would remain to be seen. Anyway, those are my thoughts, initial thoughts about it. It's a good question.
Yes, and I would say that capitalism has at its base the notion, a sort of competitive standard, but capitalism has us competing such that our basic needs are met, rather than us competing on top of basic needs having already been met. Does that make sense?
Well, it does not seem correct to me, if I understood correctly. In the first place, going back, let's say we went back to when we were hunter-gatherers or lived on the Serengeti or something like that. And so our tribe was very important to us. And of course, within that tribe, there is a dominance hierarchy kind of thing. And the dominance hierarchy is maintained ultimately to a great extent by the tendency and capacity to fight, to exercise one's power over others. So the more powerful ones were higher up in the hierarchy. So then, this is undoubtedly quite an oversimplification, but we began to stake out property, land for ourselves. And individuals began to stake out land, and thereby create the situation where if you had land, you had some things that others needed. So others would then come to you and say, please give me such and such. And the owner would say, well, if you will do so-and-so. And so that's really the beginning of slavery. And the efforts to transgress that situation would be undertaken and met with by physical violence primarily. And so we increasingly developed our capacity and our preoccupation with the development of the ability to fight. And of course, when we included weapons in that, then that became a major part of this. In other words, if we have more powerful weapons than they do, then we're the ones that win out and so forth. But then subsequent to that and developing alongside of it such that even though the weaponry thing still exists, there's something now alongside it, and that is money. Money, of course, being a convenient exchange of value so that I could get 10 of your turkeys by giving you the equivalent of a leg off my cow. And that would be better than just giving the leg off my cow for obvious reasons. So, so then what's happened is that, that we humans now have this dominance hierarchy way of organizing ourselves that is weapons and money is becoming more and more the way of establishing who the slave owners are and who the slaves are. And of course, it's a graduated thing. It's not, some people are very, very, in a very, very slave-like position and others are not. But the problem with capitalism so far seems to be that, well, there's a tendency for accumulation of money and therefore power at the very top. The small number of people that have most money, and that down at the bottom are people that are sleeping under bridges and so forth, that are homeless and that are starving and so on. So, so if that is capitalism, then I don't think the evidence so far is that it will, that it is consistent with the effort to be concerned about everybody and everybody have a basic good quality of life, and then maybe building on top of that. But now there is a proposed procedure currently that goes in the direction of that model. And that is universal basic income, that everybody gets a basic income that takes care of their needs, and then they're free to do what they want, and they can be competitive or not. They can fulfill themselves in whatever ways are most meaningful to them, which will vary from individual to individual. So that's the way I see that.
First of all, I agree with all of that. Secondly, I will say that your examining history through the lens of dominance hierarchy forms or models is very similar to the Marxist lens of class struggle.
Yeah.
If not equal, other than semantics. But I don't know enough about your perspective of dominance hierarchy to know how exactly it matches up to class struggle. Thirdly, I'm curious as to what I said that seems incompatible with any of that.
Well, not necessarily anything. Well, I guess I'd have to go back over what you said. Nothing right now comes to my mind.
Okay.
Well, you did seem to speak in favor of capitalism.
Oh, that was not at all my intention.
Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
You were describing an idea of, or you were describing why competition isn't necessarily something that we should 100% do away with,
Mhm.
because there is a world in which we could compete after having already had our basic needs met, to where it could be more like a game perhaps,
Yeah,
or
fun.
more of a facilitation for teamwork, or something like that, which
Mhm.
I agree with. And my response to that was that capitalism is not that. Capitalism has us competing so that we can meet our basic
Yeah,
needs.
okay.
Um, and and that's what you initially seemed to be responding to in disagreement with. So perhaps I didn't word it very well, or perhaps you just misinterpreted. But if
Probably.
we agree on that point, then I think we agree.
Yeah, yeah, it appears to be.
With the idea of universal basic income, I actually don't think it will work, at least not permanently, because wealth, because money is self-referential. Um, it, you probably know what I'm referring to, but
No.
okay, so for a while in the capitalist system, money represented something. You gave the example of a cow's leg.
Uh-huh.
Um, Eventually, in our country, I'm not exactly, I think this was international as well. Um, Money was in reference to precious metals, primarily gold.
Yeah.
But then I think in the 80s, um, we shifted away from what was known as the gold standard
It's a fiat
to,
currency.
right, exactly.
Uh-huh.
So thereby making money referential only to itself. Um, so because of that, there is no constant by which the market has to abide by in terms of transferring funds. So because of that, I predict that the temporary benefits, or the benefits that a UBI would provide for many people, well, for everybody, I guess, would be adapted to, um, such that people would still be making uh, as much profit as they can possibly make. In other words, um, if money is not tied to some constant resource, and particularly a constant resource that um, is relevant to our basic needs, so even gold, for example, is not great in my opinion, um, then it is not the best avenue through which to have our basic needs met. So uh, for me, rather a better version of UBI would just be universal basic groceries or housing, um, healthcare, stuff like that, rather than income. I mean, income alongside those things, sure, great. But that's my contention with UBI.
Mm. Yeah, I don't know. Well, of course, one problem is that if we're talking about what our species can become like in the relatively far future, um, where we will have undergone the third exponential change to rational ethics consistent with the HUEP, away from authoritarian ethics and so forth. Um, there will be changes in everything, and it's hard to imagine that, because if we try to imagine what something will be like at that future time, we imagine it in the context of our current way of living. And so I always use the example, I say, like, okay, 200 years ago, you tried to tell me that I would be able to get into my vehicle and travel 80 miles an hour down the road. And I said, that's ridiculous, because you would slide off the gravel into the woods and you would scare all the horses. And so if we're talking about, a world, a way of living that, or we can just simply take a look at the way we are living our lives now compared to 100 or 200 years ago. 100 or 200 years ago, how could they have imagined, or how could we have imagined doing what we are doing at this moment? So it's that would be considered miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're talking about a change that is just beginning to occur in our way of being as individual animals is concerned, like a few hundred years from now, it might be that there would be a drastic difference, and a drastic difference in the way of looking at things and so on. So it's hard to take some specific example, of which there would be many, and then imagine them to be in a situation where all of those things have changed, because we can't imagine that.
Sure.
I'm thinking about, I've not kept up with it, but the Venus Project. Have you ever run across that?
Yes, actually, I think perhaps because of you,
Uh-huh.
though it was 4 or so years ago.
Yeah.
But the idea of a resource-based economy,
Yes.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I completely am on board with that.
Uh-huh. Well, that would be in a drastically different way of living than the way that we are living now.
Yes.
But that has been an effort to try to envision it, and maybe even develop some examples of it or something like that.
Is this in response to anything in particular that I was saying?
Nothing comes to mind right now, but it would be in response to, well, the whole difficulty in saying, well, Bill, then you figure that we will be, at some time in the future, we will be communistic. There could be some truth to that, but if we take our current concept of what communism is, and then we try to place it in our current situation with the way that we are, then that's an entirely different picture. And so I really don't know the answer. It's a good question.
Okay. What I thought you were responding to was my critique of UBI. So I was waiting to hear why our inability to accurately conceptualize what the future would look like was a counterpoint to my criticism of UBI. So I don't, maybe I'm just operating with the wrong mindset here on what this conversation is, but I just wasn't quite sure if you were responding to what I had just said, or if it was just an aside or a backtracking or something else. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I think so. It's not real clear in my mind yet.
Okay.
But,
well, in that case, I would agree with you. And in fact, Marx would agree with you, at least to the extent that Marx never tried to develop an extremely detailed account of what a communist society would look like. As I said toward the beginning of this conversation, it was more, Marx's efforts were more toward a critique of capitalism than they were of a postulation of the future. He did, however, view capitalism as contained within a sort of economic trajectory for our species, which I think is not dissimilar to the trajectory you've provided with your dominance hierarchy lens. And he would argue that that trajectory inevitably leads to communism, whatever it is. But as far as whether or not it would best fit in a democratic republic or a stateless society, or the extent to which the government needs to regulate the economy, I don't think he was necessarily making propositions about those things. However, he understands socialism to be a transitionary period between capitalism and communism. So socialism sort of functions as the midway point that we can, without being overly arrogant, I suppose, try to make changes for the future. And something like UBI, as I'm sure you are aware of, it has been called like a socialist agenda, as long as any sort of universally mandated security for the people or something like that has often been referred to as socialist. And I don't actually disagree with that. I just disagree with the negative connotation.
What is the negative connotation? What are you referring to?
I think in this country anyway, socialism is a scary word.
Okay.
That harkens back to the sort of Red Scare or McCarthyism.
Yeah.
And might conjure up images of Joseph Stalin or the USSR, who we learned about in school, or at least I learned about in school, killed tens of millions of people through its universally mandated policies. Most, not all, but most left-leaning theorists would argue that the USSR represented something more akin to state capitalism than it did to socialism or communism, namely just that the government takes control of the economy, and any fluctuations in the market, rather than being organically arrived at through competition amongst private owners, is instead measured and predetermined through the federal government, which we have some of that in our country now, but for most Marxist economists, that is only ever at most supposed to function as a transitionary phase rather than being the destination that Joseph Stalin declared it was. And I think this country hasn't really been the newer generations of this country, if not all generations at this point, but for the oldest of American citizens, I suppose, haven't really had the opportunity to view communism in a different light. So that's part of why I'm talking about it here, because I think something as emergent as Humanianity strikes me as similarly bereft of attention. And I think for similar reasons. That I guess that's the case I'm trying to make here. Yeah.
I'm trying to recapture something I was going to comment on. It'll come back. But of course, one thing is, currently communism has a bad name, and the question really has to do, I mean, the whole nature of what we're trying to do, namely to understand the development here in the way that our species functions, is going to be dependent considerably on our child rearing methods. And to put it kind of simply, the naturally occurring methods of child rearing are the same as for chimpanzees and other social hierarchy animals and so forth. And it's only relatively recently that we've begun saying that maybe child rearing is an extremely difficult technical field that really requires a lot of training, because the optimal methods of child rearing are not the same as what we just naturally do. And people just naturally say that they naturally know how to rear children. After all, they were reared themselves, and they can always ask questions and so on. And one of the biggest most important areas of child rearing that I think are relevant and are changing is the whole issue of punishment. And so what I have found is that I currently take the tentative position that is a very, very minority position, that we should never punish children. And almost everyone will say that's crazy. You have to punish children, otherwise they will run wild. And they'll run out into the street, or they'll put their hand on a hot stove or something like that. Those are the usual things. And what we don't realize is all of the bad stuff that is produced by punishment, even though punishment does work in a sense. in other words, it does bring about submission and obedience and therefore a certain amount of cooperation that is forced cooperation, really. Um, the when the child is punished, is purposefully made to feel bad, and I'm not talking about spanking. That's one way of punishing, but just the way of speaking to the child, like look at this mess. What kind of person you going to be doing, and so forth. Um, all of that has a really lasting and significant effect on how a person is going to be for the rest of their lives, how they're going to feel inside, and what they're going to tend to do. And it tends to produce oppositionalism. And so for most people, to a greater or lesser extent, there is this oppositional component. Like, oh, you want me to do such and such? Well, then I'm not sure I want to do that. Or I may do it, but it's got to be on my terms, or, and stuff like that. And so if instead we had a model of child rearing that was much more like the model of the coach of somebody who is aspiring to get to the Olympics or something, then it would not be causing bad feeling in response to failure, in addition to the bad feeling that failure itself produces, but instead would be reassurance, recognition that, well, we all make mistakes and so forth, and it takes a while, and you're doing a good job, and so let's try this or let's try that. Whereupon if the parent is then the coach of the child in the child's project of growing up and becoming who that child wants to be. So people, I think, will be substantially different in a fairly basic way at some time in the future, if we ever get there. Now, we may not. It may be that next month there'll be very few of us on this planet, which will be smoldering everywhere. We just don't know. We are so powerful that we can really almost exterminate ourselves, and it's kind of iffy, it's what with people playing nuclear chicken and so on.
For clarity, is the defining feature of punishment the intent to belittle or shame, or something else? So, for instance, go ahead.
Yeah, you're getting there. It's not just belittling or shaming. It is deliberately making the child feel bad because the child has not done what the parent wants, or has done what the parent does not want. So, for instance, the parent taking the child to the doctor and getting an injection, which may hurt, is not punishment, but making the child stand in the corner or self-isolate, although different rationale is given for that, well, to calm down and so forth. Um, but still, here I am now. I've been made to leave and be all by myself, abandonment and so forth, into this timeout space. That is the deliberate, intentional uh, uh, infliction of pain, suffering, disability, and/or early death um, that we believe in, and we believe in it so strongly. Um, so, see it at some time in the future, uh, we may indeed recognize that certain people need to be quarantined because they are a danger to other people. They have behavioral tendencies that
Mm-hmm.
make it dangerous for them to be around other people. But that doesn't mean that we should make their lives miserable by isolating them and so forth. So the idea of a person being quarantined, but trying to make their life as good as possible and giving them opportunities to engage in self-growth and so forth, that that does not go over well. The person has to suffer. They have to pay for what they did. And
Mm-hmm.
so, see, so we just strongly believe in punishment and revenge. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
we believe strongly in revenge, um, and that's kind of what that aspect of punishment is. Punishment is
So
supposed to be, of course, deterrent, uh, like conditioning, negative reinforcement. But,
right.
right.
So who's to say, or yeah, who's to say that the child will interpret um, the bad feelings or the intent of the parent who facilitates the bad feelings involved in the injection differently from the intention of the parent who facilitated the bad feelings in having the kid go to timeout?
Uh-huh. Well, can you not imagine that the parent would be behaving substantially differently in the case of the injection? The parent would be sympathetic and reassuring and um, trying to make the child feel good, whereas the timeout situation would be the parent would be withdrawing affectionate behavior and isolating the child and so forth. There would be a drastic difference.
Okay, so it's not the demand itself, but the way the demand is expressed or continually expressed. So
Well,
theoretically, there's a way that you could affectionately request your child to self-isolate without them interpreting it as the parent wanting them to feel bad.
well, you could, I could imagine just as one scenario that the parent would say, uh, I, I know you're upset now. Do you want to um, stay and talk about it, or do you want to be by yourself for a while? What do you want? That would be far different. The supervision is necessary. You have to prevent your child from running out into the street and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole way of going about doing any of that um, uh, would be substantially different. So if parents were indeed able um, to relate to a child drastically differently, than what is normal and natural, then the resulting adults from that are going to be drastically different and much more able to do what their parent has done also.
I can imagine a scenario where the coach of an Olympic athlete enforces, and I don't mean to inject that word with any sort of negative connotation right now, just descriptively, enforces a standard where if the athlete fails to meet the mark expected in that particular session of practice, then they will have to do 100 reps of a certain exercise that is maybe physically painful or exhausting. So, in other words, negative reinforcement. I suppose what I'm really asking is, and again, just for clarity, as somebody who is, a novice with this topic, is there a difference between negative reinforcement and punishment? And in your mind, is there room for negative reinforcement in a future better society?
Well, there are some complexities here. Life itself has positive and negative reinforcements that are there independent of somebody adding to them. We're talking about the adding to them. When the athlete, for instance, does not accomplish a particular thing, the letdown, the failure of that would be a negative reinforcement. But that doesn't mean that the coach would say, okay, just for that, you have to do 100 whatevers and suffer. The coach might say, well, I think that if you did 100 of these, that would help with regard to the specific part of this that gave you the trouble. What do you think? You see, and
okay, so are you advocating that while there is naturally occurring positive and negative reinforcement, we should only ever add positive reinforcement to those scenarios?
Probably so. The way I currently conceptualize it is that with regard to child rearing, there are, quote, 4 levels of child rearing, and I'm not real sure that there's any precise meaning that can be given to level, but I think of it in terms of effectiveness and importance or whatever, but effectiveness and freedom from problem, but that's not entirely quite right either. It all depends on how each of the levels is done. But there's punishment, reward, teaching, and modeling for identification. And so my recommendation is indeed the elimination of that lowest level punishment. But that's not sufficient by itself. There has to be the skillful employment of reward, teaching, and modeling for identification. Just as an example, I sometimes see parents saying, good job to everything that the child does. Child runs somewhere, good job, and so forth. Now, that might or might not be appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
but in other words, to always be doing that would not give the child the experience of um, doing something on his or her own and uh, seeing how it feels and so forth. And it might lead to an expectation of always being in the spotlight and having to be praised and so on. So it's a very complex area. And then teaching, uh, there are positive and negative ways of teaching, and modeling for identification. The best example that I give of that is is a man once told me, I know the exact day that I became a man. And can you guess?
Sex.
No, the day I beat up my father.
Oh.
You see? So, well,
Hmm.
what could be more obvious? Father, that's being the man. And one day,
You're effectively replacing them.
yeah,
You're taking their status and putting it onto yourself.
yeah.
Huh. That's
So,
actually not particularly obvious to me, but I understand.
so that's modeling for identification. In other words, in this case, the father was coming home and beating up the wife and beating up the kids and so forth. And then one day, the kid beats up the father and so establishes himself in the place of uh,
Hmm.
this other person. But that's an example of and an unfortunate of the importance of modeling for identification um, and the importance of it.
Right. What about scenarios where it's not necessarily just one person interacting with another, but people interacting within a, a pre-existing system or precedent for how to conduct oneself. So in school, for example, let's say um, phones are prohibited, which was the case in my high school. Students were not allowed to access their phones during class. And if I recall, they weren't even allowed to do so between classes or during lunch. I think that's accurate. And if you did, and you were caught, um, you would have your phone taken away. Um, so, first, I'll just say I understand that as negative reinforcement.
Mm.
Um, would you say that that is an appropriate standard?
Well,
Um,
what you're doing is taking um, this way that I'm talking about of doing things and putting it in the current situation,
right.
uh, like with all the horses that are no longer there. So
Oh, I see.
in this situation, um, this is an effort to do some good by banning the cell phones, and the child um, is in the position of having to submit or be oppositional and tricky and dishonest and so forth. Whereas um, the in a future situation, the child would not be having a cell phone because the child believed it was not a good thing to do, had arrived at that conclusion, and had arrived at that conclusion because of all of the stuff that had gone on in that child's life from birth up to that point, with discussions about different things and um, clarification. Well, what does happen if you spend a lot of time on the cell phone and so forth, and what do you want for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and then what will be the effect on others if you have your cell phone at school, and what kind of effect do you want to have on others? What do we want to do within our family? Do we want to make each other feel better, or do we want to compete with each other, or um, make each other feel bad, and so forth?
I lost connection with you for maybe 10 seconds.
Yeah,
So I missed a small section of that.
yeah. So it was uh, the child learning. What kind of an effect do you want to have, not just on yourself, but on other people? And this is in the context of a child being reared within a family where there are family meetings. And if anybody is having difficulty, there's concern on the part of everybody. And then the concern within our family of how can we be of some help to the world outside of ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
uh,
So would you say that the best place, if we're going to try to strategize about how to get us to that future point, would you say the best starting point would be with child rearing?
well, uh, I don't think you can answer that question because um, the child rearing is carried out by the parents, and the parents would have to be different in some way to engage in the different child rearing.
Right.
And so I think what we're looking at is um, the the idea of a grassroots change in our species, not something imposed from above, but where our values uh, continually change, and where all the different aspects of our lives respond to those changes. So it all tends to occur uh, together. And um, so I don't think that the answer is, the way that we need to accomplish this is to change our child rearing. I think that change in child rearing would be one part of the change in general that we have, um, and so on. And that has to do with our. It will have to be the work of adults who can think um, in ways that children cannot think
Mm-hmm.
about, and can analyze and come up with things that are different than that which is normal and natural, and yet may be better.
Trying to think of which of my list of questions to ask next.
It's
Um,
probably growing.
Indeed, it is. Um, would you count um, the? Would you count introducing a mandatory course in some level of grade school, perhaps high school, um, on psychology, or and then perhaps within that class there could be a chapter on child rearing that is in alignment with whatever standards you personally hold for child rearing. Would you count that as a top-down uh, avenue,
Not
or
as
would
a,
that be in some way incompatible with the grassroots
yeah.
progression?
Well, I think the idea of top-down imposition of a requirement uh, can be a problem if the people are not prepared to and identified with uh, the requirement as something that indeed should be done. But I think ultimately, sure, in elementary school, um, children should learn parenting. And in fact, we we do that not in the school system, but we give children dolls
Mm.
and help them learn how to treat the dolls and so forth. But it's not in any skilled way that is helping the child to develop what will turn out to be good parenting procedures.
That makes sense. Um, in your experience, or in your studying or research, have you considered the any potential differences with, I don't know if this is an official term or not, but for lack of a better term, communal parenting versus parenting within the nuclear family model?
I haven't really given much thought to that. I know that there are, of course, various models. There's two parents and 2.5 children kind of a model, and there's uh, single parent,
Mm-hmm.
and, uh, and there's the communal. Um, all the children are the children of all the adults and so forth. Um, I I think it more has to do with um, other issues having to do with our culturally induced behaviors. Um,
Would you not agree that whichever model is preferred is a culturally induced model?
you mean whichever model is uh, a more successful model, right? Or
Uh, Presumably, if it's the most preferred model in a culture, it would end up being the most successful model within that culture.
well, uh, not currently. Uh,
I would say that the uh, in our country, the nuclear family, uh, two parents, 1.5 children, I think, is the standard by which we judge um, uh, familial stability, or or the familial ideal. And I would say that, well, I'm not aware of any communal parenting uh, existing on some sort of systemic level in our country. But I certainly am aware that people believe that that household is more stable and more appropriate than a single parent household.
Yeah, well, currently, uh,
And that it is indeed, from many different metrics, more successful.
mhm.
So it is both preferred and more successful.
Yeah,
Um,
currently that is, I understand that to be statistically what's shown, um, and one can kind of imagine um, that the male in such a family does not have um, a male to identify with, um, a model, um, and is and that the uh, and that the current tendency to punish and discipline then has to be done by the mother uh, in such a situation. And
are you referring to single parent households right
no,
now?
uh-huh,
Okay.
and uh, so, but if one assumed a different culture in general, uh, and the lack of use of punishment, but instead a better model of child rearing, one might not observe such a difference. Um, so it's more complex than that. I think that yeah, there are some correlations, but there are complexity of issues underneath those correlations.
Correlations between what is preferred and what is successful.
Well, I was thinking about correlations between what is done and what is successful.
Okay. Um, okay, I think we agree. Backtracking a bit, you mentioned family meetings, and I don't remember exactly how you worded it, but something about how I think the family meetings could better equip the children to know how to interact with the world outside of the world that they experience just in their familial context. Um, am I interpreting that correctly?
I think so.
Okay. That wording is what led me to ask about communal parenting, because my my chain of reasoning here is that world would would be upon you already, uh, within that model, because you would be more aware of the different roles that different adults have. Um, you might be asked from an earlier age to participate in the system itself that the community functions upon, um, and you would have, ideally anyway, you would have more resources, um, aka more adults, through which to understand a task or
So the you in this case, the you is,
the child, a
is
child.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had made that same logical chain, or if you had problems with that logical chain, considering your background.
Can you repeat briefly the logical chain?
Well, family meetings in a communal parenting model, I imagine, would not necessarily be discussions on how to how to come to any sort of terms of engagement or social contracts to help somebody live in the world outside of your small household, but would instead be about the world itself, um, the community that you're involved in itself. So we would, in other words, family is the community rather than family being a private bubble within the community.
Mm-hmm.
So those meetings would inherently, therefore, be about the world outside. And it strikes me as a good thing, but I don't know, I've never experienced such a model, so I don't know if I'm looking past something.
I think that the communal model, we may be stating that as some identifiable, entirely different thing than the familial model, and I am not sure that, and I think anything like that is a matter of degree.
Sure.
So there would be a certain proportion of the time where it would be more around the nuclear family, probably, but then in what we're talking about, a much larger percentage of the time would be multiple family interaction. And there's also the question of effective size of groups for functioning. So, in one of my books, in the first book, when I was describing rational ethical government, speculating, I could imagine that there would be the family level, and then an individual from that family goes to the next level, and that would be multiple families in the neighborhood. So there would be the neighborhood level, and then that group would have a representative going to the next level and so forth. I think came to be maybe about 9 levels or something like that, so that everybody would, so that issues would be handled at the appropriate levels, and that everybody would be represented and so forth, and everybody would know what was going on to the extent that they decided to find out and had the time to do so, and so on.
That's interesting. So basically a representative democracy.
Yes, but there's another aspect. See, again, if we take something like that and put it in our current situation, it doesn't necessarily make that much sense. But see, I think that the more that we know about a particular subject, the better our decisions are likely to be. Um, and so, for instance, using the example, if you're going to have brain surgery and difficult decisions have to be made, do you want them made by group vote of the hospital staff? You want the person who knows the most to have the biggest effect on that decision. And and we have a situation, of course, where where nobody can be an authority and know a whole lot about every subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what would follow from that? Something that is certainly not at all something that people would think of these days. And that would be, although it would be something that in the relatively near future could be implemented, and that would be that you have your card, which has a barcode on it.
A profile, so to speak.
And it would be, yes, a profile of, it would be your educational profile. So it would show how much you knew about such and such compared to other things. And then for a particular decision, a decision would be made as to what would be most needed to be known about. And then when a vote was taken, your vote would be weighted according to the match between your educational profile and the needed knowledge to make a good decision with regard to that issue. Of course, there would have to be a way that people could have a pretty valid profile on their card. In other words, could be evaluated as to how much they really did know. And there would have to be transparency about all of that and so on. So, and there'd be maybe other issues also that could affect how strongly weighted your particular vote might be. Now that's drastically different from one person, one vote. And so nowadays people are encouraged to vote whether they know anything at all about what it is that they're voting for.
Right, but today, it is, regardless of how it's advertised or what people are told, it is not one person, one vote. It is a representative democracy. So, so the Electoral College, for example, is a funneling type of mechanism, but it still strikes me as with these 9 different levels, or with that system you speculated, I would wager that the best way to evaluate the weight on each person's profile for this or that vote would be determined by the people in that level.
Oh, well.
And that's where I think we might disagree.
Well, yeah, no. In this particular model that is not well thought through, you know, and would be at an entirely different era than the one that we're in currently or have ever been in.
Sure.
Um, the uh, each level of people, and the 9 levels came about by, if I recall correctly, assuming that the optimal number in a group would be something like 15. Um, so out of that 15, a person would be chosen who uh, was most knowledgeable and who wanted to do so to go to the next level, and so forth. Um, so they are then representing the people beneath them, however many levels that might be.
Right.
Um,
So are you saying that to determine who was most knowledgeable, the group deliberates amongst itself and then
yes,
comes to a conclusion?
and that's a separate idea from the idea of the weighted vote.
I see. So would the weighted vote be a system parallel to this system? Or are they just two completely different postulations of how society could change?
Well, the weighted vote is more something that could be accomplished in the relatively near future in our current situation. But there's another thing to consider. Going back to the hierarchy of groups of 15 approximately, um, there is no reason why any individual in a group of 15 is going to be most knowledgeable, is going to be very knowledgeable about all of the issues that need to be understood. So outside of that basic decision-making hierarchy would be the way of establishing those who had authoritative knowledge about certain fields, and those people would be consultants to the group, and but again, of course, we currently don't have any well-organized way of establishing that. And then there's another whole uh, social entity or social mechanism that I think needs to be implemented, and that is a completely transparent um, activity, uh, organized activity that is for ongoing debate about
Oh,
any,
yes.
and so that people who were more knowledgeable in their debate that was witnessed by anybody in the world who wanted to see it um, would they would be able to demonstrate the bases on which they were arriving at their conclusions and so forth, and could be, quote, fact checked by anybody. And so um, the open exchange of ideas um, uh, continuously um, would be very, very important, and that would be our ability to develop the skill of friendly debate rather than unfriendly debate,
Mm-hmm.
which has to do with importance and um, and um, methods of achieving success that were not based upon the knowledge that needed to be had to arrive at a correct conclusion, something like that.
What I'm still not clear on is what I heard you say is outside of this model
Hierarchy of 15.
decision making,
Mm-hmm.
a decision needs to be made about how to evaluate the weight on each profile,
Well,
which implies a separate decision-making entity.
well,
And this,
well, no, this hierarchy of groups of 15 representing each other, representing 15 below and so forth, that's not associated in my mind with the weighting of votes. I'm not even sure that the weighting of votes would be appropriate in the groups of 15 hierarchy.
I see. I think at this point I would just need to read each separate idea um, rather than being concerned at the moment with how they're connected to each other in order to really understand them.
Yeah, I think, well, this uh, hierarchy of groups of 15 would be at a much greater distance in time. Um, and so the weighted vote idea is really to deal with that everybody has a vote and that all the votes are considered, that they all have equal weight um, in a situation where um, if indeed knowing more about the subject increases the likelihood of making a good decision, then the weighting of those votes would be important. But um, so in the hierarchy of 15s, or whatever you would call it, I guess a group member might indeed be an expert in some particular area, but that would be very, very unlikely. And in fact, that would probably be an impossibility because the people, especially the higher they were in this hierarchy of 15s, the more time, the more of their lives would be devoted to just that. And so, therefore, as far as sophisticated, uh, good knowledge about certain fields, uh, those would be people outside of uh, this relatively small group of people that were um, in the final decision-making process with regard to issues that were relevant to those below them. You know.
You mentioned that the weighted vote idea is something that is um, plausibly foreseeable. Do you have any sort of guesstimation for when that would be implementable, or any sort of realistic mechanism?
No, not really. I don't consider myself to have that kind of perspective or knowledge. And again, it's kind of like there's this whole uncertainty as to whether we'll even be here next month, and so on. So, and who knows what somebody will think up next that is highly destructive and a major concern and so on. And then, of course, we could also have another virus come along and it was even more effective. And so there are lots of different things, but setting aside those, which can set things back, but also hopefully should stimulate us to become more sensible and more forward-looking and prepared for such eventualities.
Naturally occurring negative reinforcement, one might say.
Yes.
So what is it about that idea that leads you to intuit that that it would come sooner than the 15 stage hierarchy thing?
Yeah. Well, one has to, if we're talking about a governmental structure, how we do things, who gets together with whom and so forth. We have currently a governmental structure that's worldwide. I don't mean that so much. Well, in a sense, I do. In other words, that there's a lot of conflict and instability and stuff like that. But we have a way of doing things, and this would be a significantly different structure, way of going about doing things, and as we know from the issue of communism and so forth, maybe an idea can be a good idea, but you can't just therefore say, oh, okay, so now I'm going to impose this on the rest of the world, and we're going to throw out what we had. And that means, in other words, revolution and establishment of something new. That's very high risk, very likely to fail. So how would it come about? And I think it would probably come about by virtue of us developing a structure like that was only for the purpose of debating issues. And whether that would be the same as this entity that I was talking about earlier is a good question. But then as we, but still there would be, it would come about relatively slowly. But in the situation that we have currently, in our current situation, everybody goes and votes. And so to have their voting card with their profile on it that automatically weighted their vote and so forth is something that could be carried out, implemented in the current structure. It would there would be some things that would have to be developed that we don't have, like a a way of establishing that indeed that weighting on the card would be accurate or relatively accurate. And so how do people establish that? And of course, a person could enter a field or take courses or something and maybe improve their profile in that area. So it would need to be something that was revisable and so on. So the details as to how it could be accomplished should be very multiple and hard to anticipate right now. But that's something that we already have a situation where everybody has a vote, presumably. I know that there are interferences and so forth, but so it would be an improvement of the current way of doing things, whereas this other would be a drastic restructuring of the whole governmental system.
I see. If you were to dare to figure out how the weighting system yourself, what do you think you would say about a knowledge or appreciation for theory of topic X versus the experiencing of topic X?
Well, I would not consider myself to be an appropriate person to make that kind of
Fair enough.
judgment. You know, there's lots that I don't know about, and but experience, knowledge, in other words, whether academic or actually in the field kind of thing. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, so long as in the field doesn't have to mean something exclusively professional, but just experiential. So,
okay. Well, what that has to do with then, I think, is how one would go about assigning a rating method. If we're talking about I think it would have to be. That's a good question. I would still weight it in the area of well, in the area of theory. A person could be in a field for a long time and be not competent in that field. And so how does one determine whether one is competent or not? And I think that ultimately goes back to whether one is able to come up with the appropriate existential propositions. In other words, beliefs about the way the world is and how it works and so forth. We do have examples, I think, of people that have been in the field a long time and then have been found not to have good knowledge and to actually be somewhat destructive because of lack of knowledge. And then there's the whole business of when you're in a field like the field of medicine, how you keep current. So that keeping current would be, I think, what you're referring to as theory. But one would also, to be a good doctor, one has to have skills other than just the knowledge, have to be interpersonal skills and so on.
Right. I think my concern with this whole idea, considering it is a top-down, it would have to be a top-down implementation to start it off.
Except that the problem is that there has to be a bottom-up change in values, ethical values. In other words,
so that would come first.
Well, I think that it is a two-way process, because the people at the top presumably are knowing more about the whole business than all those people at the bottom. And so conveying information in that direction from top down would be important. Recommendations and convincing of population, but also those people at the top are going to have to respond to what the people at the bottom or in the middle are saying that they want. So it's an interactive process. So I don't think it's just like we were talking about the child rearing issue. Well, child rearing can only be changed by adults, but adults changing child rearing are going to have somewhat of a different kind of child rearing themselves in order to do that. So, so we're talking about neither bottom up nor top down, really, but both.
The power that the people on the bottom have depends on the overall context within which this conversation is being had between the top and the bottom, or the top and the middle.
I'm sorry, say it again.
The power dynamic between the parties having the conversation or the interaction, I think you said it was interactive, depends on the context within which the conversation is being had in the first place. I'm not aware of a mechanism in our country that gives the people in the bottom enough social capital to really have much weight in the conversation to begin with.
Well, if we're talking about political, that's what determines who gets up there ultimately. But I guess the problem is it may be that it's not a real useful useful way of categorizing to use the concept of power. Well, but influence
Okay.
Is what is meant by power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to some extent. Um,
The Marxian term would be social capital.
yeah.
If we have what I'm really saying is, if we live in a society where money can functionally give you more than one vote, and then also a society where government, big government and big business are are sort of congealing together, then it seems like there could not be a solid basis upon which to start the conversation.
The conversation.
The interactivity between those who are already uh, in the know versus those who are demanding something new or something different.
Really following um, currently we're seeing it as the people at the top versus the people at the bottom to a great extent, and who is more powerful. And uh, what we're wanting is actually a division like that, but instead a and the people at the top are wanting to hear, well, what is it that you want? We don't have a system like that to the degree that I'm talking about. At least that's my understanding. Um, although the people at the top certainly imply or present themselves as, being for us and so on, but we know that um, has to do with just marketing, so to speak.
I I understand that. Um, so basically, other things would need to change before we could have this particular thing change. Um, but what I'm saying, what I'm trying to make the case for is that no matter how many things change before we declare the the um, the weighted vote change to be plausible, um, so long as those changes are occurring within the system that already exists, I'm not sure that I could ever trust who determines the weight.
Right. I've made reference to that we'd have to have ways of determining that were satisfactory, and there's a long way to go to that. And one of the important elements would be transparency. In other words,
But what I guess I'm trying to say, I want to make sure you understand what I'm saying. So transparency is not something I expect from our government. And presumably the government would be the ones implementing this policy, or even figuring out the algorithm or series of algorithms to determine the weight in the first place, or to determine how to determine the weight. So the idea is, okay, well, one change that needs to happen is the government needs to become more transparent, or better adhere to the value of transparency. I don't think that's possible, or at least not sufficiently so, with the system that we have already.
The system that that's right. So that has to change.
Okay, the difference that I'm trying to lay out here is I'm not sure what that was. Is basically that I think a revolution would necessarily need to exist prior to such a change in order for me to trust those who would be in charge of implementing the change. Because any changes that are implemented prior to that revolution would not be in service of the goal that you or I might have with that change, or with implementing that change.
Well, first place, I don't think that it's a change that suddenly on a particular date would take place. And it's something that first would have to be voiced as a value by the general population. Examples of processes like that are like Medicare for all and universal basic income and things of that sort that are gaining popularity. And so over a period of time, that change can take place without it being a, quote, revolution, although referring to it as a revolution can make it be more exciting to people, perhaps. You know, oh yeah, we need a revolution and so on. But yeah, there's as far as whether it is going to happen or not, I mean, that's highly uncertain. But I think it is valuable to try to think about it and advocate for it if it makes sense. If it seems like it has errors in it, then it needs to be rethought. So what you're talking now about is how it can happen rather than whether it is a good idea. I gather that you feel like most of what I said sounds like a good idea, except that how in the world is it going to happen? And maybe it can't, or something like that.
In the case of weighted voting, too much is left unconceptualized for me.
Yeah.
For me to know, even on a very abstract level, whether or not it's a good idea. with the other model that you presented, that seems pretty good to me.
I mean,
As
15s,
I'm sorry.
the 15s.
Yes.
Uh,
But I still feel like I need to have more details about it. So just read what you said about it already. For example, with regards to UBI and universal healthcare, I actually don't trust the government to implement UBI in a successful way. So I would count that as an example. But further, with the kind of revolution that I'm envisioning, UBI would become an irrelevant policy, because income wouldn't exist. But in regards to universal health care, that does happen to be a policy that I think, while I'm sure there would be decisions made that I would not be in favor of from the higher ups, I think that it is overall something that would improve the lives of millions of people, before any revolution was necessary. So, in other words, what I'm saying is the examples you have provided, I do not think are similar enough to the change we've been postulating about, to bolster the claim that the change we've been postulating about could occur before a revolution or as part of an alternative to a revolution.
so the basic area of disagreement is that you see yourself as in favor of change produced by revolution, as opposed to I, who believe in incremental change. And the reason that I believe in incremental change is because revolution is a process of battle. It is one group against another. And my whole orientation is that we need to come together and work cooperatively. And so if there's going to be change, it would result from ever increasing discussion of the issues and debating back and forth and so forth. Until it became apparent that we were ready to decide whether we really wanted to do it or not, or something like that. But revolution, I think, implies well, fighting is what comes to mind, but that could be in different forms. But it has to do with who is going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what's important is for us to stop the process of deciding whether our group is going to win versus the other group, and more come together and say we are all one. And we may have to go about this slowly and make mistakes and correct them and so forth, but that we're all in favor of moving in this direction.
And I would say that that standard could never be met within the framework that we currently reside in. Um,
Yeah, I agree. See,
the dominance hierarchy basis upon which society has been structured uh, precludes or excludes the opportunity to view everybody as one.
but
The
see,
the
that's
hierarchy is uh, within our way of thinking manifests itself
mhm.
in the structures that we created based on our way of thinking.
Yes, of course. And see, that's the point. The humanianity idea is not how can we change things this year or next year or in the next 10 years or something like that to make it a little bit better, doing everything that we do, but doing it a little bit better. It, uh, it is an exponential change that is just beginning to occur and is hard to see. And so, if we're talking about the humanianity thing, then, like I frequently say, we as a species, considering how we may become at some time in the future, are now just a toddler. We're just getting our legs. We're just, but there is the possibility that on this planet we could get to a much better place, and that we can do that by understanding what it is that is happening. It's already happening to some extent, but it's just very small extent. So what frequently happens again is if I say something about how things might be in the future, uh, in your mind it would be, yeah, but that would scare all the horses, or the equivalent. In other words, that's just not the way we are. Right, that's not the way we are currently. So the humanity idea is something. It's not just how can we change things tomorrow.
Sure, but you can understand incrementalism in different contexts. So I agree that incrementalism, on a very broad level, is how to expect humanity to progress toward um, a society based on rational ethics, etc., that does its best to maintain the HUEP. But if we're looking at it on a through a political lens, uh, I don't think that the same standard has to necessarily be transposed. Um,
You
and I
mean
don't
current
necessarily think that's what you're
political
saying.
current political lens?
Could you repeat the question?
You mean current political lens, the lens that we're looking through now? Um,
Yes, or a lens that you could look through now. Yes. Um, I, what I was trying to say before is you were saying that, how do I want to say this? I imagine you would agree that the farther we move up this cone, the uh, the less violence there will be.
um, I think that that is correct.
I do as well. Um, what I don't necessarily think that implies is that we will um, I don't necessarily think that will correlate one to one with the the I forgot the word you used, but the expansion of the worms on one end and the atrophying on the other.
Yeah, and somebody listening to us may not know that we're referring to something on the Humanianity.com website, the metaphor of all of these worms crawling up this conical mountain, and each of the worms is a religion that is atrophying at the bottom end and moving and growing at the top end from being stuck in the past or very, very conservative to becoming more liberal and everything. And so that the religions are increasingly becoming more understanding of each other and so on. And when they finally get to the top, it will be all one religion, and that would be Humanianity, the religion for humanity. But currently, this is just referring to the process where our religions and we humans in general are moving up, are becoming more progressive in our thinking, questioning the things that have been held over from the past and so forth, and able to move on and come to increasing agreement with each other.
It's really hard to know how to frame this. I don't think you would disagree with me when I say that we live in an extremely violent world, and that while it might in many ways be less violent than it was in the past, it is still a tragically violent place for the vast majority of human beings who inhabit it.
Yes.
Okay. I think that the systems which have the most power currently, and perhaps up to this point throughout history, have perpetuated, manipulated, controlled that violence. And so I recognize revolution not necessarily on an individual level, but on a collective level, to be a form of self-defense. So I'm trying to reframe, considering a few conversations back where we redefined violence such that if there is room for necessary PSDED, then we would no longer call it violence. So violence would be the execution of any unnecessary PSDED. So self-defense, therefore, would not be considered violence categorically. So with that in mind, I think where we disagree is whether or not we recognize revolution as a humanity defending itself.
Yeah, so we're getting, see, self-defense is a situation of violence. But if one is then going to use the term violent to pertain to an individual and mete out some punishment to anyone who is violent, then the person acting in self-defense should not be categorized as being violent, but it is a situation of violence. So it depends upon what the terms are referring to. But again, revolution, as I understand it, is the overthrowing of one group by another, no different than in a tribe of chimpanzees, one chimpanzee overthrowing another, or a couple of chimpanzees taking down the the alpha chimp, and so forth. And I'm seeing. I don't think that the way to give up that tendency to fight, to struggle for dominance and fight, is to engage in struggling and fighting. I think.
Me neither.
I'm sorry?
I don't think so either.
Yeah. And that's why, I mean, the model, as ineffective as it currently is understood in our developing United Nations, supposed to be all the nations of the world, united, in other words, working together, sitting around the conference table and listening to each other, trying to understand each other, and to figure out what's going to work the best for everyone, as opposed to one country establishing its greatness over others by having more powerful weapons and whatever else, strategies and trickery and stuff like that.
But who has the most power in the UN is based on who has used force, trickery, etc., the most effectively.
See, I said that it is not working well. Of course it's not. I'm talking about the model itself, the idea.
Right.
And
Right.
so there's some progress in that direction. It's not like the United Nations doesn't work at all. It's barely effective. I mean, it's doing some good, but the idea of it is the giving up of struggle for dominance to sitting around the conference table and listening to each other and being concerned for everyone, to make it a united world, meaning that our species is our tribe.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that is its origin, nor do I think it's its current function. I think that one can interpret it to represent that model, and I would agree that the model that they have interpreted is a good one. But I think the UN, rather than being a reflection of that sort of progress, is instead a ceasefire. But also in the meantime, we are still going to try to vie for power within the UN.
Of course.
And we are going to, so it's not acknowledging any sort of value in the other beyond the notion that they could dominate me instead.
Well, I understand that we are still uh, barely above chimpanzees. That we are still uh, primarily driven by our struggling for dominance. But still, the idea uh, it's not like the idea is totally foreign and stupid sounding of people saying, let's get together and try to figure out what's best for all of us. I mean, and so it is a new thing. But again, we're just a toddler. That's why the UN can't be an example of how we're going to be 200 or 300 years in the future. The UN is the way it is
Yeah,
now, but the concept is there. If
and
without
that's what I'm disagreeing with, uh, or at the very least, I'm disagreeing with the idea that the UN represents that concept. I think the concept is there. Of course, we're talking about it right now, but as far as the UN being a reflection of that concept, that's what I'm challenging. And the reason I'm challenging that is to sort of point out that I like I think the UN is perhaps the best the world powers can achieve as they are.
right, right. I'm again not saying that the UN is working anywhere close to 100% to the concept that it is, but that it represents.
Well, I'm saying it doesn't represent. I'm saying it does work. I don't know if I'm going to say 100%, but it is sufficiently working regarding the concept it's representing. I think any sort of idea that it is, um, even its name, I think is a pretext or a pretense for uh, uh, a human-wide tribe or United Nations or whatever. But I don't think that any participant is actually participating with that goal in mind, or maybe individual representatives are, but the nation that they are representing is not. Um,
Well, I understand that
and
we
that's how it's supposed to be. That's how it's designed.
that we, but the idea of democracy as opposed to dictatorship, the idea of voting rather than fighting and shooting and killing is relatively new for our species. And uh, so we have to indeed understand ourselves and overcome these basic tendencies to struggle for dominance, to fight, and so forth. We have to understand them and inhibit them. That's it. Our ethics has to change in that direction. So again, uh, it can be a mistake for me to give as an example something like democracy or the United Nations as uh, a movement in a particular direction um, with the idea that, oh, well, we've done it. Now we've done that. You know, that, see, now we have United Nations, as if, you know, the idea of the United Nations is now uh, fulfilled. No, it is something that we chimp-like creatures are trying with our language and our science and technology um, to uh, accomplish. Um, so what I'm talking about that I've labeled humanianity is not something easy to understand. It's like again, we're still down relatively close to the bottom of that conical mountain, and we have a long way to go. But uh, we've recognized that there is some value in going upward in progressing and getting away from the way that we normally and naturally do things to something that is much more difficult and something that we need to train ourselves to do and practice at doing so that increasingly we get better and better at it.
I agree.
Gosh.
Out of curiosity,
Mhm.
let's say uh, the makings of a revolution were surfacing, and it seems to be the case that there is going to be some sort of event or set of events that are going that run the risk of changing the world in some major way. Uh, if that was the scenario you found yourself in, what do you think the most appropriate response would be? Or I guess what I should say is first, do you think that one would be forced to pick a side in that scenario?
Well, uh, I think that there are um, sides to be taken. I'm not sure what the question is. Taking one side or the other and promoting conflict. I'm not sure you mean that.
What I'm saying, I'm trying to present a hypothetical where conflict seems to be inevitable one way or the other. And uh, I'm wondering what you think would be the most appropriate behavior uh, in that scenario. We don't
Well,
even have to take revolution. We can just say conflict.
uh, we're always having to live our lives. What the answer would be, I would have to try to figure out what would be most consistent with the Humanian ultimate ethical principle. As little pain, suffering, disability, and early death as possible, as much joy, contentment, appreciation as possible for everyone. So it would quite easily be a very complex um, decision to make. Maybe one so complex that one could only flip a coin.
Yeah. Uh, I think that a revolution is coming. Um, I think that the way the system is set up um, makes that claim inevitable, or makes the reality implied by that claim inevitable. Um, I think we can go in, I guess, three directions once we've reached that point. One direction is the direction that Joseph Stalin went in, or Adolf Hitler went in, or Mussolini went in, um, or to a lesser extent that China has gone in, um, which many would cite as examples of communist revolutions. Uh, However, the result is actually an authoritarian state
Mm.
imposing its will on the people.
All right.
Uh, so that is one direction. Uh, the other direction is a regression So we somehow we somehow maintain a separation between the market and the government, and maybe, I don't know, maybe we incorporate new laws where you can't be a CEO of a corporation and also in the president's cabinet. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe we abolish Citizens United, stuff like that. I'm assuming this already would have been dealt with by this point, though. And then the third direction is the direction I would prefer, which is um, transformative, which is transformative as opposed to regressive. And the first option I provided is also transformative, just though in a way I don't prefer. Um, in such a way where we have challenged the necessity of profit at all, challenged the necessity of competition for basic needs at all, challenged the necessity to interfere with other countries and determine what their governments should look like at all. Um, what I'm trying to say is those things aren't going to be changed unless there is a transformation. I think our country will always be imperialistic, will always do whatever it can to, in a global capitalist world, will always do whatever it can to maintain its position at the top of the market. And the result of that is the exploitation of everybody in who is involved in that market, who is under their thumb. So this is why I say that it is ultimately a form of self-defense, because the civil wars that occur in Africa, the civil wars that occur in the Middle East, the struggle for the independence of Hong Kong from mainland China, the drug war that exists in our country, the cartels that exist in Mexico, all of it is fundamentally rooted in global capitalism. And I see no way to switch from that does not, unfortunately, but inevitably require force.
Well, yeah, and I don't I don't agree, I guess, with the basic idea that there are these three alternatives and that's all there is. And it's a matter of who is going to be more powerful than whom. And so it involves a fight to see who's going to win, i.e. revolution. Mm-hmm. I think that there is another way, and that is where we de-escalate, where we get to know each other and get to know each other and become friends that care about each other, essentially. But that value has to be somehow advocated for and to spread more than it has so far. But I think it has to a great extent. I mean, to a small extent, but great, relatively speaking. People are increasingly saying it is better to talk, listen, and understand and identify with and empathize with each other than it is to de-empathize and fight as a struggle for dominance to see who is going to be over whom, more powerful than whom. And so that would be my position on it.
In response to that, I would say that those who have the power are not at all incentivized to shift their view toward such values.
Not currently.
And rather than the people...
I'm going to say that currently that is true to a great extent. Those people live in families and they have friends and they are in groups that have relationships with each other. And so I think that they are going to be listening to the people around them, and that newly emerging values can and do spread that change things. And so I'm not quite as hopeless as you are, but and I also feel like it's important for me to be optimistic and to do what I can to advocate for this new way of being that we can make ourselves into. I mean, I work on myself to try to become more that way that is, I think, a better way, and so on. So
it's worth saying that I, maybe I should say, other than on this general point, place a fairly high value on Humanianity or my exposure to it. And I think it has informed, it's been a significant player in the game of informing my way of thinking over the years. Ever since the first time I was introduced to it. And I should also say that I'll recall the example of that you gave a couple of conversations back, where you could imagine yourself concluding that perhaps Hitler did need to be removed permanently, but that does not mean you have to enjoy removing him. That's where I find myself regarding violence or revolution. It's not exciting to me or thrilling. I mean, it is technically exciting in that it brings up my anxiety and adrenaline and all that, but it's not appealing. It's not something I look forward to. And nor do I think it should be for anybody who holds positions similar to mine. In fact, I would argue that, I guess anecdotally, based on my experience, those who align with me politically are also those who are the most concerned with people who are in many respects different from themselves. And would similarly conclude that revolution is an unfortunate inevitability. But anyway, I think so long as we understand where that disagreement ends up between us, that basically that we disagree on what the future holds, what is inevitable in the future. I'm willing to, I feel less compelled to make my case, I guess is what I'm saying. Not saying we can agree to disagree, just saying that you know my position now. And so from here, I guess I would just say, I'd urge you to look into the idea of class struggle and keep in mind your understanding of dominance hierarchy, and perhaps you'll come to the same conclusion I have, that maybe because we're toddlers, we have put ourselves in a position where there's going to be a fight, because we didn't know any better. So it's not about the fight being the way to move forward, but just something that needs to happen before moving forward on a systemic level is possible. Even if on an individual level it is, of course, possible.
Well, I guess several things that it sounds to me like you're saying, well, okay, so we know each other's viewpoints. So, we just have a disagreement. So, that's at least that's where we stand. Now we can go have a beer or something. And the and I think instead that there is value to exploring this further.
Just to clarify, sorry to interrupt, but
Uh-huh.
I find that to be a mischaracterization of what I said.
Could be.
I think we understand. What I'm trying to say is, I can't currently think of a way for me to add anything further to my position.
Uh-huh.
I need to look into it more myself
Uh-huh.
before I can think of new ways to bolster it or whatnot. So in the meantime, I'm just suggesting looking into other people who hold my position. I don't see that as a permanent agree to disagree defeatist kind of standard. Just like a checkpoint, like we've reached a checkpoint.
Okay,
And
so you're saying that now we need to stop these discussions between you and me, where you go and talk with those people that agree with you about uh, revolution being necessary and important. Am I hearing you right?
I'm sorry, would you mind saying that one more time?
Okay. Am I correct that you are saying, okay, so at this point, we're at a checkpoint here, so we can stop having our discussions, and I, meaning you, uh, need to go and discuss more my ideas about revolution with the people who agree with me, or something like that. It sounded like.
Um, yes, though that is not everything that I think would be ideal. Those are just some of the things that would need to occur. Uh, I would also prefer, if we were to pick this back up, this particular topic, I would also prefer uh, that you hear it from more people than me, basically. Um,
Prefer what?
that you become more exposed to, I guess, pro-revolution individuals than just myself, um, to a similar degree of rigor or effort that is involved in these discussions. Maybe that's too much to ask because we've gone on for quite a while about this. But all I'm saying right now is with this particular topic, I can't think of anything else to add from my perspective. So unless you have more ways you can think to contribute to this particular topic that I can respond to such that we could further our understanding on it, I don't know where else to take it other than to say temporary pause on this topic and gather more resources or information so we can come back together to discuss it again. But in the meantime, I'm perfectly willing to discuss other topics with you.
Well, I think that there would be value in discussing this topic more. I seem to have a different way of thinking than you do. We have substantial differences. And so it would be, I think, helpful to explore those differences. And one of my high-level ethical principles that I believe is consistent with the Humanian ultimate ethical principle is that when there is difference of opinion about issues that have anything to do with our quality of life, that there should be continued discussion to see where those differences arise, how they arise, and to work toward agreement as an ultimate goal. That to work not necessarily that we would ever get there, but we should always try, but always with integrity of being as accurate as possible in our knowledge and in our methods of communication and so forth. So
yeah, I don't think I'm saying anything to the contrary. Maybe with what you just said in mind, I'll just refine what I said and say, I don't currently know how to continue this conversation from my end without verification of my own accuracy or adding more information such that I am more accurate than I have been.
Well, on the other hand, you know everything that's in your mind. I don't. And I would like to hear more from you. I only got vague impressions of these, of the necessity for revolution and the three alternatives. And
Sure. Yeah, so right. So I said, I don't know where to go from here, so I can't think of anything else to add. But
well,
if you have questions,
yes, I was going to say,
then obviously we can continue. Yeah. I never meant to exclude that option. So we could totally continue on that track.
yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so we'll have future discussions. We'll get together and
Sure.
explore these and other issues. That
Sure.
sounds good.
Cool.
Okay, so sounds like we are maybe at a checkpoint, a stopping point for this one. And,
I think so, yes.
well, I very much appreciate your effort and what ran through my mind is when you were saying, oh, well, humanity has meant a lot to you, et cetera, et cetera. was to ask you, okay, so what are you doing to promote it? Are you talking about it on Facebook? Are you advocating to people that they consider it, et cetera, et cetera? And, but if your feeling is that, well, it actually runs counter to what I, Jordan, believe, then certainly you would not do that. But at any rate, that's what ran through my mind.
I promote it similarly to how I promote other things that have functioned similarly to how Humanianity has in regards to how my perspective has developed over time. So I've recommended to some of my friends that they check out the website.
Oh,
I've told friends about these videos in this YouTube channel.
uh-huh.
I've brought some friends to philosophy discussion group as a sort of trial run, so to speak, because since it's less focused in its content,
Mm-hmm.
for me, like if they're already not interested in that format, then I'm not sure they would like the added pressure, or at least the added pressure that I would want to exist, because it's pressure that I apply to myself regarding a discussion of a specific topic.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So I've done that, and so I've talked with some people about the website, and its format and some of its content.
Okay. Yeah, with regard to philosophy, the discussion group, I, being the organizer of that and being the leader, you have the group dynamics there. And it is generally felt that whatever that, well, you know, Bill has this humanianity idea, which we steer away from, kind of thing. It's normal group dynamics and so on. So, yeah, there's so much that really could be done, like the use of the belief manual and the forum, the belief manual to work on basic ethical philosophies and share and compare them and debate issues and so forth. There's an awful lot that that can be done there, and but it's very inactive currently, and so I know people have said that I need to pay more attention to quote marketing and stuff like that. So, but at any rate, okay, so let me know when you're wanting to take up where we left off or embark on something else, whatever you want to talk about.
Okay, sure. And I'll just say I appreciate your efforts as well in these conversations. I know I ask a lot of questions, and some people get exhausted by that
Oh, not I.
approach, but you seem to welcome it, so I
Oh,
appreciate that.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's very helpful to me. Okay, so this will be it for today.
This will be it.
Okay, have a good week. Take care.
Thanks. You too, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Humanity, now we all can see. Humanity, how much better we